Thank you, Connor, and thank you, Jacqueline. I'm very excited to be giving this presentation tonight on a project that I've really enjoyed working on. I'd like to actually start with by acknowledging that here in Newfoundland, I am on the ancestral homeland of the Beothuk, as well as the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq, and also acknowledge Labrador as the traditional territory of the Innu and the Inuit. And I'd like to thank you all who are here tonight for this lecture. I am really thrilled that you're able to attend. So I will share my screen. Here goes. It worked when we were testing it, so it should work now. And yes, excellent. So what I'll be talking about tonight is the ghost ship map of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is a project that I started as part of a graduate assistantship with the Memorial University of Newfoundland Folklore and Language Archive, which I'll be referring to as MUNFLA because it is so very long to say. And it looks roughly like this. And I will link you to that in the chat later on so that you can all see, so you can all have a look and interact with it. It's an interactive map that records on which I've recorded the different legends of ghost ships around the province that are mentioned in the archival legend cards. So this is what it looks like on the whole, and let's delve into it. So when I started this project, I had to, of course, start with establishing the criteria of what I was going to include and what I was going to exclude, because for anyone who is not familiar with Newfoundland or Newfoundland's reputation for folklore, this is a province, this is an area with just an incredible amount of folklore, huge number of local legends and really fascinating historical stories, as well as more fantastical tales. And that is why I'm studying folklore here, in fact. But I started out with a couple of very ambitious ideas. I thought I could make a map of all the ghost stories, all the ghost legends around Newfoundland. And then I also thought, well, if I'm just focusing on the maritime side, maybe I'll do a map of all the shipwrecks, all the ships that have ever been wrecked in Newfoundland. And you can see how busy the map already is with just the ghost ship legends. There is, in fact, a map of shipwrecks of Newfoundland. It is densely populated. I only had a semester to finish this, and I wanted it to be user-friendly and easy to navigate, which a map of shipwrecks most definitely would not have been. So so I started by kind of excluding a few different categories and just focusing on stories about shipwrecks that were said to return as phantoms, or phantoms that were seen at sea, or variations on sort of strange phenomena, strange encounters that had taken place at sea and that were attributed to ghost ships. There were a couple of interesting stories that I decided to keep on the map, even though they didn't, strictly speaking, fit the category of ghost ship. One of them was this one from St. Lawrence on the southern coast. There was a ship beached during a storm, which was then taken back out by the waves, and no one ever really knew where it came from. And that was in sort of an in-between category where it's a mysterious ship. It's not really a ghost ship legend, but it is a derelict. It is a shipwreck. So, and it also was given this nickname, the Devil's Ship, by the community. So it had this sort of sinister reputation. And I thought, I'll include that. That's still close enough to the topic that we're dealing with. Another one that was a bit of a grey area were things like apparitions from shipwrecks that were seen by people on shore. And the Southern Cross disaster, the wreck of the Southern Cross, in which all 173 sailors were lost in this shipwreck in 1914. There are several stories about people seeing someone who was on board the ship at the moment that it wrecked. And well, that's not again, it's sort of in a gray area in terms of the legends that I was planning to deal with and planning to put on the map. I decided to keep that one on there because it was, um, well, because it was close enough to the same to that category, and also um, because it kept appearing in the legend cards, it kept turning up as something that was important. It seemed like it was very significant and it should be on the map. Actually, I should clarify what I mean by the legend cards, because in Munfla there is a collection, there's a file of cards, little index cards with local legends connected to various places around the province, and they're divided into different categories. So you have stories about animals, stories about cures and sort of folk medicine, and then you have an entire quite extensive section on ships and shipwrecks, as well as a section on ghosts. So those were the two main ones that I consulted for this project, as well as sometimes looking at animal legends, because sometimes there would be animal ghosts connected with shipwrecks, or there would be stories of pirates and phantom pirates, which would be again related to this topic, and some of them, depending on how relevant they were, some of them would end up being on the map. And some of these cards were connected to longer manuscripts and more extensive stories, more extensive narratives, and some of them were just short mentions of a fairly brief legend. So that's what I was working with. That was sort of the process of making this map. And ideally, by the end of this presentation, you will all have an idea of how to use this map and how to find stories on it, and we'll be able to go out and yeah, enjoy reading it, enjoy using it. Oh yes, and then there were stories that I included just because they were interesting, just because they were found amongst the legend cards to do with ships and shipwreck, and they were so gripping that I decided to include them anyway, such as the crew of the Labrador. When their ship was damaged, when they struck a rock and the ship was going down, they put a message in a bottle basically saying that they had all drowned, and as a farewell to people ashore. And the bottle actually reached shore after they did, because they ended up surviving and making it back to safety. And then a year later, the bottle turned up and the message was published in a local newspaper. There wasn't a lot of information on this wreck given in the archive, but it was it was just a very fascinating story and a surprising happy ending to that story. So I decided to include that just purely out of personal interest. In terms of the methods for creating this tool, well, I should actually start with the reason for creating it. So as I was saying, the province of Newfoundland is hugely packed with legends and with ghost stories and with really interesting tales. And I am not originally from Newfoundland. So reading some of these stories, I had no idea where they took place. I was looking at them and thinking, all right, this is clearly somewhere by the sea, but that doesn't narrow it down. So initially making the map was just a helpful thing for me to know where these places were, to know where people were talking about when I was hearing some of these stories. And I also thought it might be helpful for other people who are coming in and they don't know all the small communities around the coast. And this could fill in some of the gaps for them by way of ghost stories. And so the first thing after sort of gathering all the stories out of Munfla was to find a way to put them on a map, find a map tool to make them public. And MapHub was the tool that I used. You can build a custom map for any purpose. You can make different color codes and there are actually quite a lot of interesting features that I'll go into a bit later. But it's a free tool, it's a public tool, and it's very user friendly. So that's what I ended up going with. Deciding on categories to make searching for specific stories easier, um, as well as trying to include whole narratives, trying to include as many details on stories as I could. Um, this really depended on what sources were available in Munfla. I was also constantly searching for repeated narratives and patterns of stories that appeared more than once. This is always something interesting for folklore, is finding where there are repetitions and where the same interpretation or the same experience comes up multiple times. Of course, interpretation is always key with these stories. When someone sees something mysterious, they can think, oh, it was a trick of the light, or it was something, it was just I just imagined it, or they can think it was a ghost and it was specifically this ghost ship that has been seen here before. So that's always it's always the most interesting part, is seeing how people interpret the experiences that they've had. So initially, my notes looked roughly like this, because of all of that process of gathering together thoughts and ideas and stories and legend cards and accession numbers by the dozens, but eventually I had to sort them out and really focus on what the map was actually about, which of course is stories. This is a map of legends that are either personal experience or community experience, things that are told as something that really happened to someone. So a lot of personal experience narratives and what are called memorats, as well as stories that have been passed down in a community or have been part of a community for a very long time. So because Newfoundland's history is so much maritime history, what really came out was the variety of stories that exist in that context, and the different purposes that they can serve, the different needs that sometimes they can speak to. For instance, a lot of them, I'll be getting into this a bit more later, but a lot of stories were about we're filling the gaps in a mystery, or we're filling the space where maybe a ship had been lost and no one really knew what had happened. But a ghost story could be a form of closure, it could be a form of acknowledging that there was that uncertainty, that unstable part of history that no one really knew the end of that story. And of course, the blending of history and legend always makes for narratives that raise really interesting questions. So as I was saying, some of the stories are recounted very, very sparsely. This one, Phantom Ship in Catalina Harbour, the story goes that two friends saw a ship breaking through the ice that was in the harbour and then vanishing, leaving behind a trail of broken ice. And they believed that to be a ghost ship. This one stood out because it was the only one of its kind that I found in the legend cards. I believe it was the only instance I found of a ghost ship actually breaking through ice. So there are several instances of a ship. In one case, there's a vessel sailing along and they see another ship, and one of the sailors swears at it. So the ship turns and it sails straight through them. There's another one where a ship sails straight through an island. So this is a bit of an unusual story for a ghost ship legend, because it actually has a physical effect on the environment around it, and it actually breaks through a trail of ice. But yes, that was a kind of unusual one. And as I was saying, the variety that appeared in these stories, the many different forms that these narratives could take, is really one of the most fascinating parts. As well, as I was saying, these stories can serve a purpose of being a way of closing a wound in a way, or at least acknowledging that the wound is there. They could be memories of a tragedy that happened within the community. So in Fogo Harbour, there's this story of a light coming through the Tickle, which is the sort of the narrows at the opening of the bay, which breaks into 5 parts, and that's interpreted as being this man and his 3 sons and his nephew who are all lost at sea. So there can be stories like that as well, where it's really deeply tied to a particular event in a community. And searching for patterns within such a wide range of stories could be a little bit of a challenge, but it was also a very interesting aspect of doing this research. There are some expected patterns, some things that do show up in several stories, like ghost ships as weather warnings, because that's something that anyone going to sea would always have to be aware of. Ghost ships as memories of specific disasters, or maritime ghosts in general, not even just ships, but individuals from particular shipwrecks, as with the Southern Cross example that I mentioned earlier. They could also be ways of moderating behavior. Like there was one legend of a man who died at sea, and then his shipmates had heard his last request to be brought back to his hometown and buried there, and instead they buried him somewhere else. They went to land and they just buried him in the nearest graveyard, and then his ghost, of course, appeared on the ship, after which they realized what they had done, and they turned around and they retrieved his body, and they brought his body back to where he had requested to be buried. So there could be very clear lessons sometimes in ghost ship legends. There could be these messages in the story. Sometimes the weather warning stories took unusual form. Like there was one story that I came across where these men are in a boat and they're fishing, and they see a headless swimmer going by. And they decide, well, that's us done for the day. And they turn around and they go home. And of course, a storm immediately comes up afterwards, and they realize that they've done the right thing. Other types of legend, other patterns that emerged were a little more unexpected, like the connection between ghost ships and buried treasure, or especially ghost dories and buried treasure. These stories where people hear a boat being rowed to shore and they realize that there's treasure nearby. And it turns out that Newfoundland actually has quite a few buried treasure legends. And that is a common enough motif around the Maritimes. For instance, in Nova Scotia, Helen Creighton, who wrote Bluenose Ghosts, which is one of the major collections of Nova Scotia folklore, mentions, I think she devotes an entire chapter to treasure guardians, which were usually said to be, especially in relation to pirate stories, there'd be people who were killed to guard the treasure and were buried with the treasure, and their ghost would attack anyone who tried to dig it up. And that seems to come in the form of boats in Newfoundland in several of the stories that I found and that are on the map now. So that's one that I might actually have to create a new category for the intersection between buried treasure legends and ghost ship, ghost boat stories, because that did come up on multiple occasions. Another important pattern was the connection between the sea and the shore, and the appearance of shipwreck ghosts to family members or those who died on board ship, like the fellow that I was mentioning earlier, people who were buried ashore but appeared on the ship. And that again was one that came up on a couple of occasions. It wasn't terribly common, but it did recur a few times. Some of these patterns are a bit more difficult to map. There were, I believe, 2 legends of ghost ships retracing a route that they had taken on which they had been wrecked or on which they had disappeared. They'd never made it to their destination, and they're seen somewhere along that route, just always on their way and never arriving. So there's one that was seen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Strait of Belle-Isle, and it actually was said to go all the way down to Bucksport in Maine. It was a ship that was accidentally blown out to sea and then drifted there for 51 days, or took this route anyway for a 51-day journey, and the light from that ship can be seen retracing its final journey, essentially. Yeah, so this is the phantom ships of the Grey Islands, one of the many instances where phantom ships are said to precede a storm or are said to appear as a warning against there was a storm coming. And that one really, it's quite understandable why that would appear again and again, because that would be one of the most important things for anyone whose livelihood depends on the sea and the weather. So doing this project, making this map, really pinpointed certain places around Newfoundland as being associated with different aspects of its history. A lot of what I found very interesting in the process of finding these stories was the association, the very place-based, very localized legends, and sometimes pieces of history emerged that I hadn't necessarily expected. Like, for instance, the French history in Newfoundland is not always the first thing that leaps to mind, and the language isn't that prominent here. But French ghost ships appear on the map, for instance, at Lansawash and Ship Cove, and the old French fort at Dunville, where in Placentia Bay, which I will point out shortly, where a boat was heard rowing ashore, and the interpretation of that story was that they were French soldiers returning to the fort. And it's also, of course, the pieces of history that are told in these stories, there might be some bias towards things that people want to remember, or the things that communities are interested in and are maybe more aware of themselves, because again, it's all down to interpretation. When something unusual happens and when someone sees or experiences something unexpected, it's all down to how they read that experience and how they retell it afterwards. So, of course, pirate treasure is a very popular theme and a very exciting theme for many storytellers, and these also tend to be very bloody legends, some of them quite tragic legends. So it's not always the parts of history that people are most happy about, but it's often the parts that they find most colourful, I suppose. So for instance, this story from Petty Harbour and Shoal Bay, which is on the Avalon Peninsula, quite close to St. John's. And the story goes that 3 men were digging for treasure and they noticed a sailing vessel out to sea and suspected that it was a phantom pirate ship. 2 of them saw a dory coming from the vessel and they decided to leave, but their friend stayed, and when they returned, he was dead and the hole that he'd been digging was filled in. And the story continues to elaborate that they actually later disappeared from their homes. So some of these stories can be quite sinister, even for the witnesses or the living characters involved in them. It's not the sinister aspect or the darker aspect isn't always confined to the shipwreck or the pirates, for instance. Sometimes it extends to the witnesses. Some of the challenges in putting this project together and in forming as accurate and coherent a picture as possible of these legends the names of communities and the names of ships could be misspelled or could be changed, could repeat. Um, and that's something that actually I've had um, a bit of outside help with, because someone who heard the story of the ghost ship map got in touch with me and actually corrected one of the um, names of the vessels, which allowed me to find more information on it and allowed me to actually look up its history rather than being sort of at loose ends about it. It was listed in the legend cards as the SS Eddie, and um, the person who corrected me on it said actually it's the Ethy, and it turned out that there was actually quite a lot of information available on it, whereas I wasn't finding anything on the SS Eddie, funnily enough. Place names as well could be repeated or could change. For instance, there are two green islands. There's one in Fortune Bay and there's one in Catalina. So trying to place that on the map, trying to figure out where to put that was another research challenge, which honestly ended up being unresolved. I chose to put it in Fortune Bay, and I noted that it might refer to the Green Island that's in Catalina, because I was not able to find enough details to be sure either way. This is a picture of the SS Ethy from the Maritime History Archive at MUN. And here's the story from Green Island of the phantom ship that was seen by two lighthouse keepers swaying back and forth in a storm, and then by morning the ship had disappeared. So I've noted that I may have identified the wrong location, but it's also possible that it did take place at Green Island in Fortune Bay. And I've also put up pictures of the lighthouses at both locations where this story might have taken place. I also want to give a shout out to the big map in Munfla in the archive, because it was a very valuable resource when I was trying to find places that were not on Google Maps. There are a lot of very small communities and sometimes abandoned communities, as well as very tiny islands all around Newfoundland. A lot of places that just are difficult to find on Google Maps. And the big map didn't have that problem. It's a very large framed map in the front of the archive. And whenever I didn't know where something was and couldn't find it by other means, I would just, I'd look on the legend card for any details. So this one, St. John's Island, said that it was in the Strait of Belial. So I just went up to the big map and searched around until I found this tiny little dot of an island, this little rock in the middle of the strait. And that was it. So the story there, it's another one of the sinister pirate treasure ones. It's a tale of St. John's Island, which was said to have buried treasure on it. And every June the 25th, there would be a dory that was heard rowing ashore, and that was connected with the buried treasure. In the late 19th century, so the story goes, two men came to untimely ends by looking for the treasure. They went to dig it up, and in the process, one of them died, and the other one was given a phantom slap, just slapped by a ghost, and later on died. And it's attributed to, it's said that slap was the thing that killed him. So apparently it's very dangerous to go looking for buried treasure around here, which is, I suppose, why it's so difficult to find. And a lot of the legends really raise the question of interactions with ghosts and interactions with ghost ships. So, so the question of whether they're dangerous and whether they pose a threat to the living, which in the case of these phantom pirate ship stories really seems to be the case. But in the stories about ghost ships as weather warnings, it's a little more ambiguous, and it's a little more actually serving a more helpful role. So there's that question of do these legends end somewhere? Do they end with the removal of the ghosts, or some way of putting them to rest? And what do the ghosts mean for the community? There was one story in which a burial service put a stop to a ghostly crew's presence. And there was another in which a very similar situation, it wasn't resolved that way. So again, a lot of these stories are about unresolved things, about open mysteries, open wounds of the past in a lot of ways. Here are the contrasting stories. There's in both cases, they're stories of phantom voices and phantom cries. One's from the Change Islands in Notre Dame Bay, and one's from Fairyland on the southern shore of the Avalon Peninsula. And in both cases, there's a burial ceremony performed, and the ones in the Change Islands, the cries cease. It seems like the phantoms are put to rest, and in Fairyland that isn't the case. So that's always interesting to see where these stories end, or how these stories end, or if they don't end at all. And as I was saying, the main thing, the main question, the main difference in all these stories is one of interpretation. Are these ships helpful weather warnings or ominous signs? How are people's behaviors affected by the presence of a ghost ship, or the sighting of a ghost ship? Do they see them from the sea or from the shore? How do they respond to them? That's always the key factor. And I think a good case study of this is the story of the Blue Jacket. That was a shipwreck in the late 19th century, which was quite famous at the time, and then became even more famous in a way with the publication of a revised version of the story of the wreck. So for more details on the wreck itself, I definitely recommend reading Dale Jarvis's Haunted Shores, which is a very excellent book on the ghost stories of Newfoundland, and has a full account of the wreck of the Blue Jacket, as well as the version that was published in the 70s, which made a lot of changes to the historical account. So it was published in newspapers at the time, and there were a lot of details available, but a lot of those details were changed for the 1970s account. I think it was 1977 that this account was published, and the drama was really increased, and it was already a tragic story, but it was given a lot more theatrics, I guess, in that publication of it. And then the interpretation of the sighting of the Blue Jacket as a ghost was also altered a bit. The version published in 1977 stated that seeing the Blue Jacket was a death omen. It was when you saw it, that was it. It was just an omen of impending tragedy and impending death. This doesn't seem to be reflected in the legend cards, for instance, where it's mentioned 3 times. It is the best represented phantom ship of the entire archive, as far as I have seen. There's mention of it near Seal Cove, where fishermen assume a phantom ship to be the Blue Jacket. A girl witnesses a phantom ship that again is assumed to be the Blue Jacket in Port de Grave, and then in somewhere else in Conception Bay, it wasn't specified, but a man actually used lumber from the wreck. Initially, he was wary of using it, but then he found lumber further up the beach, and he thought, okay, this probably isn't from the wreck. This is probably safe, and he went and did some construction with it. Afterwards, he started to hear voices from it. He started to hear strange sounds emanating from the wood, which made him realize that it was actually from the shipwreck. And so he removed it, and the sounds stopped, and he was safe. So that's the nearest that the stories in the archive come to a sinister interpretation. And according to Dale Jarvis in Haunted Shores, there there is some talk of it being a weather omen, a weather warning, but the idea of the blue jacket as a death omen seems to be more something that was brought in for the later publication, for just changing the interpretation of it a bit and making it maybe more sinister, rather than, well, a weather warning can actually be quite helpful. So in a way, it wouldn't be a bad thing to see a phantom ship if it means that you have the chance to turn around, bring your own ship to shore, and escape from shipwreck yourself. It would still be frightening, I imagine. I don't think it would be a good experience to see a phantom ship, but it does not necessarily mean that you are going to die. Ah, yes. There are also stories that are a little bit difficult to explain. So there's this anomalous, there's one story on the map and in the legend cards and in the folkloric archive of Newfoundland that's a little more difficult to attribute a source to. And that is this one. So, oh yes, over here in Dunville, that is the French fort that I was mentioning earlier. That's the location of it. And this is in the southern part of Newfoundland. It's very zoomed in, but this is towards the south of the map. So this is a bit more of an unusual story. The phantom Greek galley, which appears on fire and crewed by naked screaming oarsmen and disrupts fishing, understandably enough. I don't think it would be easy to fish in peace with a sight like that bearing down on you. But where does it come from? And why does it appear in Placentia Bay, where, as far as I am aware, there is no history of Greek galleys appearing in that area. There's no particular history of building that type of ship in that region. And again, I'm going to look to an article by Dale Jarvis for this, because he gives a bit more background on the apparition and on the stories that are told about it. Apparently, this story reached the height of its popularity in around the 1920s, but the first print appearance of the tale of this sighting is in 1962 in a book by P.J. Wakeham, who claims that the sightings go back to the early colonization of Newfoundland, which again is very difficult to explain. I don't really have a clear explanation or interpretation of this, so it's just a very interesting and odd find for the legends of Newfoundland. It doesn't fit any of the other patterns, and while there's, as I was saying, there's definitely a lot of variety in these stories, it doesn't really fit anywhere. So I hope that I've illustrated a few of what I consider to be the most fascinating aspects of ghost ship legends in Newfoundland. Well, I say Newfoundland and Labrador, but Labrador is actually very underrepresented on the map, and that's an area that I'd be interested in looking further into in future research. So for now, I'll just say ghost ships of Newfoundland. But I'd also like to just mention the usage of this map and the different categories that it currently has, and the way that you can use it to search for particular stories. So if there's an area that you want to know more about, or a type of story that you want to know more about, you can search the map by category. These are subject to change as I decide what makes the most sense for this map and what makes it the most user-friendly and easy to interpret. And each category can be made visible or invisible to the user by hovering over that little eye symbol, and if you click on it, that entire category disappears. And the next, so as you can see, this is if all the categories vanish apart from the blue, which is named ghost ships and known ghost ships where the vessel itself is identified in the record. And as you can see, that's a very small number, and they're all sort of gathered around the Avalon Peninsula, apart from maybe one or two. So that's one of the more researched areas. And even with unnamed vessels, there are certain areas that seem to attract more stories and that seem to be better represented, largely because anything on the Avalon Peninsula or close to the Avalon Peninsula is going to be more accessible to students at MUN. So of course the areas most researched are the more populated areas closest to the university, and so some of those categories again are really going to shift in the next few stages of this project as more patterns are drawn out, and hopefully as I learn more stories from different regions and perhaps from Labrador as well, we shall see where the next stage takes us. And once primary research and interviews are a possibility, then hopefully, I mean, knock on wood, I will be traveling a little bit to find out more. And in the meantime, one of the next steps for this project is linking some of the material from MUNFLA to the material from the Maritime History Archive at MUN. The lower image here is a picture of the blue jacket. Further up, there's a picture of the Southern Cross. So linking stories that are in the map to other archival materials will be really, really amazing. MapHub has so many great features that I'd like to make more of and that I'd like to use more. For instance, another story that could be elaborated on is that of the Jane Hunter, which was wrecked off of Trepassey. And there's a ballad that's sung about that wreck, and I think it would be really interesting to link to a video of someone singing that ballad, or link to the text of that ballad when people are looking at the story on the map. And this clip of the ballad doesn't go all the way to the end, but the writer blames the government for not building a lighthouse at that point, and attributes that to being the cause of the wreck. So that's another kind of interesting element of it, and another way that it becomes embedded in local folklore and in local legend. And further uses for MapHub, kind of the next step for me as well, is making a secondary map that's more of a storytelling map, as I also I do have a YouTube channel where I tell maritime ghost stories from around the North Atlantic, and I would like to link that to a map that is built through MapHub, and where people can find either go from the video to seeing where the story in the video took place, or go from the map to finding the video. And there may be some crossover between this and the ghost ship map of Newfoundland and Labrador. So to finish, here are a couple of resources which I would like to leave you with. The first one is the article from the Telegram, which talks about the Greek galley ghost ship, that apparition, and is just a very, very interesting bit of background on that. The second one is the Maritime History Archive at MUN, where I got several of these photos. And finally, the book recommendation of Haunted Shores and Ghost Stories of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I see that we are not yet over time by some